Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
I'm a work in progress, and I don't want to point to the places where I'm weaker, right? I get it. And it actually builds trust when you say, we're trying to figure this out. We're not done yet. And then when people get hired and inevitably bump up against things, they're not surprised. And they're also assured that this is on the organization's radar.
You're more likely not only to get some very, very highly qualified people to want to join your team, but also that extends further out into cisgender people too, especially when it comes to sort of younger, up-and-coming talent.
What does it take to make your hiring process truly inclusive of trans and non-binary people? In this episode, we shine a light on what actually makes a difference, from avoiding bias in job ads or interviews to respecting privacy during background checks and reference calls. You'll hear surprising stats about the recruitment potential of trans candidates, along with what not to say, how to communicate your inclusion efforts clearly, and the thoughtful details that matter, like healthcare coverage. We'll also share personal stories and practical tips, because even if your process isn't perfect yet, there are still meaningful ways to show up with support. Let's move beyond fear and tokenism and start hiring with purpose. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Elle. How are you doing today?
I'm doing so well. How are you?
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. I am also doing well. So it's a sunny, beautiful day, even though there's lots going on in the world, still finding these little pockets of sunshine.
I feel like that is, so the fact that it's sunny for you today, it's rainy for me today here, and I am delighted about it. So I feel very at home today.
Is it because it's a cozier thing for you? Or
I love cozy. I'm a cozy queen. Like it when it's cozy and rainy, have my blanket on, even though it's summer, and I'm loving it. I'm living the dream.
Well, hey, I'm sure there are many others who would join you in that enjoying of coziness. So cool.
So recruiting, a lot of people, even when they're trying to be inclusive, when they're setting up their recruitment, they don't necessarily always realize how early bias can show up. So how can that bias show up even before the candidate has entered the room?
Yeah, so true. Hey, may not realize, but just, how, say, we've put up a job posting can provide early indication of, where an organization is at in their inclusion journey, even subtle words that people are using to talk about it, or the absence or presence of anti-discrimination statements. There's, all these little clues, and certainly trans and non-binary folks are generally fairly primed to seek out these subtle clues, because unfortunately it's very hard to determine where there is safety and maybe a lack thereof. And so these words and the way things are set up in a job description do matter. Even how the website is set up can give some indication. If, say, for example, there's only references to men and women in the workforce, that says something about perhaps non-binary folks are not on the radar of this company. I don't think it's ever malicious exclusion. It's just afterthought or lack of thought. And so these things can deter somebody, or they can encourage them based on what kinds of words are used within that. And so it is important to look at those things even before somebody comes in to be interviewed for a job, because that they may not actually apply because of how things have been worded or set up, or not able to find clear indication of inclusion.
So let's say that somebody is recruiting, they've put out the kind of application forms, and they've got a load of people who are interested, and somebody comes in and discloses that they are trans in an interview.
Right.
What would be the way that you would want people to handle that? Because I would imagine that a lot of people would immediately go deer in headlights, don't know what to do.
Yeah, freeze in the moment. They're like, oh no. Even if they've gotten some education, they're trying to Rolodex that quickly back into their mind of like, okay, what did they say? What I
Yeah.
should do? Yeah, I can appreciate that moment of like, oh shoot, what do I do? How do I handle this? The easiest thing is to thank somebody because they're usually stating that for a particular reason. Uh, Sometimes people don't share, and that's okay to
Hmm.
honor that as well, right? We don't need to know, but if people do share, they're usually anticipating some sort of challenge. So it's good to thank them for sharing, and also to follow up with, if there's any supports that they need through the process. And in that way, there's an open ended question that allows you to understand where they're at to say, oh, actually, I anticipate this to be an issue, or, I'm worried about reference checks.
Hmm.
I was fired by my previous employer because I was trans, right? So there's all these things that people are carrying with them, or even just the fear of being
Hmm.
discriminated against. And so that allows a little bit of space for that to be surfaced in the moment, so that you can ensure specific supports along the way based on what they raised. And if it's just a matter of like, oh, I wanted to let you know, nothing else, then that's cool too. And then you can just kind of continuously be aware of things as they unfold, and offer other options along the way as you maybe encounter things that you didn't expect. Say
Hmm.
this person has two first names, a legal one that's their past name, and a current one that's not legal, that they go by on a daily
Hmm.
basis. And so you might then be aware of that issue and be like, okay, I see you have two names. We only have one name field. Let's figure out a way, to
Hmm.
to handle this situation. So just being open and responsive, but also matter of fact. You don't have to
Hmm.
make it a big, huge deal. Um, it's more just now this is on your radar, to
Hmm.
be ready to respond in the moment.
You said something just then about how some people might not disclose at all in the interview. If somebody suspects that somebody is trans,
Mm-hmm.
they've come into an interview and you suspect that they're trans, I imagine that that would bring a lot of panic as well, and like
Mm-hmm.
knowing whether they should bring something up or whether they should avoid it entirely, or whether they should, what they should say or how they should not say things. So can you sort of go into that and like more around what we should not be doing when we
Mm-hmm.
suspect somebody's trans, or if somebody is disclosing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes people are what we call visibly trans, right? Not everybody is, but there are some for whom people can piece it together, maybe based on the shape of their body or a number of factors or features. And so in that moment, people typically, if they're the ones interviewing or a part of the hiring process, typically people want clarity. They want to know, what am I dealing with, right? That's a very
Right.
common kind of inclination among humans. I don't
Hmm.
think it's like a bad thing necessarily, but it is really important not to push people past their comfort. And if somebody is not raising something like any other sensitive detail, we don't, especially in an interview process where there is a power dynamic, right? The people
Hmm. Yeah.
interviewing have more power than the person being interviewed. It is, and it's also, there's a legal aspect to it. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to it specifically, but we're not asking people their gender, right? Are you a man or a woman? That's just off the table. Similar to, are you pregnant or do you plan to be pregnant, right? So these types of things we want to be very sensitive towards. Uh, and also, there are ways to subtly, without specifically stating it, show support, right? One way to do that is to, doesn't have to be everybody, but maybe a handful of folks who feel comfortable, they can share their own pronouns, right? And then that
Hmm.
signals, without calling it out, that this is a safe place where we exchange pronouns if needed. But we're,
Hmm.
again, not forcing that person to provide their pronouns. And if they don't, then they're not inquiring. Most of the time in interviews, you're talking directly to the person. And so you're saying you, not he, she, they, or any other pronoun. And so it's just then being more direct in your communication. If you do, have sidebar conversation with someone else, if they haven't provided the pronouns, I would just use they, them pronouns as a
Hmm.
placeholder until more is provided.
Hmm.
And in that way, you can provide a relaxed environment where people can come forward to share more if and when they're ready. And that actually goes a long way to kind of holding back on one's own desire for certainty to
Mm.
show that person in tangible ways that it is a safe place for that to happen. And then it's not a kind of coerced thing and people can share when they're ready. And within the interview process, really just focusing on their skill set and what they're capable of and what's required from the job is what's really at play. Certainly, people, one of the things that has come up in court cases is, publicly facing or client facing positions. People can be shy about hiring trans folks. And,
Mm.
in one case that was deemed discriminatory. Basically, somebody wasn't going to hire somebody because they didn't know, they thought that
Yikes.
their clientele would discriminate against the trans person. So they
Mm.
like preemptively discriminated against them. It's a bit confusing, but
Yeah.
that's not allowed. And so just there, you may have to then, if that person is selected based on their skill set and their qualifications, then you may need to take some extra steps to help protect them in the workplace if you
Mm.
anticipate some of the clientele being confused or not knowing or whatnot. So, but those are conversations that you can have at a later date after the hiring process.
You have already touched on this, but I wanted to go back to it because you mentioned, for
Mm.
example, sometimes people have a chosen first name and also a legal first name. So when we're collecting personal information during hiring, what kind of things can organizations think about, or like what do they maybe need to be more thoughtful about when it comes to that?
Absolutely. So there's a few different components to it. The first name being one aspect of that. So it gets a bit complicated depending on the organization and whether they're involving a third party for recruiting. So
Mm.
many larger organizations will involve somebody to do the recruiting for them, which I appreciate. There's a lot of
Right.
effort involved in that. And so may not have direct control over all of the things I'm about to say, but certainly can advocate with the recruiting agency because more often than not, it's on their radar. And so if you, as the company and the client of that recruiting agency, say, hey, this is not working, we need this, then
Mm.
they often see the need for it and are able to change it. If an organization has their own systems, it's really important to ensure an inclusive hiring process, including the first name. So making sure people can record their legal name and the name they go by on a daily basis. Some people say preferred name, others chosen name. There's name to use. I like that because it's very clear. This is the
Mhm.
label and it's okay, this is what I use when I'm interacting with this person. Then there is also typically, especially organizations that have either goals or objectives to do more hiring among different facets of especially marginalized communities. They're collecting demographic data to be able to
Mhm.
monitor how much or not as much of a particular group of people, which I appreciate. Then it puts people in a bit of a pickle, especially, say, trans and non binary folks, because it then people are kind of torn between, do I share information and it counts towards diversity hire,
Mm.
or do I out myself and that complicates my hiring process? Or maybe even I don't get the job because I'm trans,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so there is something to be said about thinking that process through more carefully. And we've certainly advocated for a broader question that doesn't require specific outing in that way. So a broader question because, I have diverse experiences and you can list the ones. And so at least you have one box that people can check without having to say, I am trans. And in
Right.
that way, there's less likelihood of discrimination. It's
Mhm.
not eliminated, but so there's those kinds of things to think about. There is also other information that could be collected depending on the organization. Some already have started, but offering the option of sharing pronouns before somebody shows up. Some trans and non binary people really like that because it kind of takes out that awkward step of like when to share that, if to share that,
Mm.
how to share that. It's like already shared. And hopefully people are referring to that before the interview to know how to do that properly. So those are kind of three pieces that generally are collected. There's more that we can talk about a little bit later, but there's also things like collecting information about previous jobs and
Hmm.
reference checks and whatnot. But that's another topic.
Hmm. We've been focusing quite a lot on the sort of hiring side
Mm,
of it, but from the sort of perspective of a trans or non-binary person, obviously they don't necessarily know all of this going into
mm,
it, that there are all these things set up. So what kind of things are trans and non-binary people considering before they even hit apply on a job posting? Like, what are they
mm.
necessarily looking for?
So many things, and of course, it's not on every trans and non-binary person's radar. But if they're wanting to assess safety, they're looking at how the job description is written, what's required, even kind of the tone and information about accessibility. And this is not
Hmm.
just accessibility from like a disability perspective, but just general, broader accessibility where, if additional supports are needed, this is who you go to talk to, or here's a web page on how to, access those. So just a
Hmm.
bit of forethought in terms of a smoother hiring practice, recognizing that not everybody has the same needs within
Hmm.
a hiring process. And sometimes trans and non binary folks are not just looking at whether gender diversity has been accounted for, but they're looking at what are you talking about in terms of Indigenous truth and reconciliation? Have you considered people with disabilities and their needs? And seeing kind of a broader approach to various needs. Obviously, if somebody is trans and a person of color, trans person with disability, they need that full complete picture for
Hmm.
their for information to know if it's going to be a good hiring process. But also if they're not a part of those communities, they care whether something is being done. And an organization that is dealing with all of these various matters or figuring out what they're going to do speaks volumes to the
Hmm.
receptivity to knowing additional things that maybe aren't on their radar, or knowing that perhaps there's already some things in place that it will be a fairly smooth process, or at the very least, if there are issues, see people can bring them up without it being a big deal.
Hmm. I think I would definitely, if I were looking for a job, which I'm not,
Yeah,
if I were looking for a job and I was looking, and maybe they didn't mention non-binary, but I could see that they had considered disability, they had considered kind of Indigenous applicants and the needs that they might have, I would
yeah.
probably be more inclined to believe the
Mm,
best of them, if they, even if they hadn't mentioned non-binary issues. I would be more inclined to think that they would consider it if I brought it up, or
yeah.
you know what I mean. So I
Oh
definitely
yeah.
get that.
They've already gone through a process and have kind of flexed those muscles, something where they've practiced it to then be more comfortable with additional things if they're
Hmm.
not on their radar. Yeah. There's so many places that people are looking. They're looking to see if there's information about washroom access.
Hmm.
They're wanting to have insight into whether the organization provides gender affirming coverage, extended healthcare coverage, even if they don't need it for themselves, just the fact that it's there,
Hmm.
that it's something considered and offered, coming out guidelines, anything to, again, even if they don't need them, that gives some sense of what type of work the organization has done.
You were saying about, the guidelines just then, and essentially how can organizations be upfront about their
Mm,
equity and inclusion practices, like the
mm,
you mentioned earlier, like a link to a web page talking about all of their policies or whatever, but like what does that
yeah.
actually look like on a wider scale?
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I find that organizations can sometimes be shy about what they've done
Hmm.
because they don't want to be seen as bragging or being like, look at how awesome we are, right?
We're
And
so woke.
well, that too, exactly. It's just like they don't want to be seen like patting themselves on the back or anything
Right.
of that vibe. But I will say that there's a way to do it that is about transparency.
Hmm.
And many, many people, particularly people in younger generations, really appreciate transparency, even if it's not their topic or their
Hmm.
need, right? They just want to know what's this organization about? And typically people do that in the values and the mission statement, and those are important, and it's good to put those out there that include, statements about equity, diversity, and inclusion, or, even if you don't want to use those words specifically, being supportive of one another, or, whatever language people want to use. And also to spell out the specifics of what that means. And you can be matter of fact. We're like, we do
Mhm.
this, and this. Maybe don't provide all the detail, but just something to point at, whether it's on trans and non-binary issues or more generally. But these are the things that we've worked on. These are the things we're not done with yet. That,
Mhm.
to be honest about not being done, is actually really powerful. And
Mhm.
I know it's like some organizations are self-conscious about not being done, and
Mhm.
they tend to, I don't know if it's hiding, but want to not showcase that,
Right.
which I
Sure.
get it. I'm not a, I'm a work in progress, and I don't want to point to the places where I'm weaker, right? I get it.
Mhm.
And it actually builds trust when you say, we're trying to figure this out, we're not done yet. And then when people get hired and inevitably bump up against things, they're not surprised because you've
Mhm.
like already indicated. And they're also assured that this is on the organization's radar. Like they don't have to do the effort of bringing it up to be like, hey,
Mhm.
I don't know if you know, but X, Y, and Z. They'd be like, oh, no, they've already said on their website, they're dealing with this. And
Mhm.
it's maybe annoying or upsetting, but there's a hope of something being different. And that builds trust in
For
ways
sure.
that maybe is a bit counterintuitive. But I always encourage that, to spell it out.
I think it's so much easier to give grace when you can see that
Mm,
there's an effort being made. I think
yeah,
that
yeah.
would be surprising to hear, though. I can see
Oh
that a lot
yeah,
of orgs maybe wouldn't want that to spell it
no,
out that they're
yeah,
struggling a bit.
yeah. And I think organizations hesitate to then also put a timeline on it, right? Because sometimes
Yeah.
timelines are kind of difficult to determine or figure out. And there is interest in knowing timelines, for trans and non-binary folks. Are we talking about months, years,
Yeah, of
decades?
course.
So, I mean, people can, or organizations can try out different things and see what the response is. And I will say that many trans and non-binary folks talk amongst themselves, whether person to person or online, about
Mhm.
companies. So there's information being disseminated about organizations, and people are actively looking for safety. And
Mhm.
as much as possible that an organization can share that, and you don't have to do a press release, just having a space on the web page, or something like a handout that can be provided,
Mhm.
a number of different vehicles for that.
So once you've established that you're going to hire somebody and you're doing all the kind of next steps, there are
Mm,
things that seemingly are pretty obvious and that everybody has to deal with, which would be, for example, getting references together, amongst other things. But
mm.
that kind of thing has like an extra layer of complication for trans people. And I was wondering if you could explain that a bit.
Yeah, it's such an important consideration. It may not be on the radar of
Hmm.
many either human resources or hiring committees, and that is the reality of having been employed with different names. And
Hmm.
so this kind of sensitive detail, especially if somebody has already changed their name legally and really doesn't want to share, generally
Hmm.
doesn't want to share their past name, comes with a lot of pain for many, because it's, like people were not understood for who they are. And there was a name attached to it that was used thousands, tens of thousands of times in their lives, So
Hmm.
it, people can, they have varying relationships to it, but generally want to avoid it. And so having to go back to employers where the previous name was used can present an extra layer of challenge, especially if it's kind of more distant
Hmm.
past. Generally focus on the more current employment when doing this type of reference check. But if there's a particular skill set that you did in one job that was a little bit more in the distant past, that can present a challenge, because you have to circle back to that employer, tell them that you have a different name, potentially even, explain with being trans. and you don't know what kind of response that will generate on that end,
Mhm.
right? Everybody is up to speed or understanding or maybe even hostile of trans
Mhm.
folks. And so then that can impact the type of reference they provide. And so this is like awful dynamic. And it's not just that possible dynamic, but it's actually thinking it through and just the emotional labor of like trying to anticipate what will
Mm.
happen and kind of jumping into the unknown. And so puts them in a pickle. And of course, references are important. I'm not suggesting that they not be done, but I think it's working collaboratively with the trans or non-binary person to say, "Hey, I appreciate that." References might be a bit tricky for you, or could be tricky. Don't want to, conclude that it's always tricky. It might
Mhm.
be really simple for some, but just opening the door to thinking through which references, if there's a particular thing, your skill set or qualification you're really interested in, helping them through thinking which ones to prioritize, and then also being ready to receive references and that are negative, understanding that there might be some bias in there, right?
Mhm.
And not to take them completely at face value. And it's not to say that there aren't problematic trans and non-binary employees, right? But you have to kind of
Right.
weigh these things a little bit more. So,
Mhm.
because there might be these additional factors.
And like, are there any other areas? I don't
Mm.
know what really is involved in this kind of process. So is there other things, like I'm imagining, I don't know, like police checks, or
Uh,
like are there other areas that this comes up?
yes. Then background checks are a big other challenge for trans and non-binary folks, and understand why background checks are necessary,
Mhm.
especially with folks who are working with kids. Like, that's critical,
Of
right? We need
course,
to do
yeah.
background checks. And this is requiring folks to, in many cases, go to the police, right? Get fingerprinted
Mhm.
and provide their past name. Like, that's a standard part of background checks. And
Mhm.
in the way that folks, the people on the hiring committee or in HR will get somebody's past name, even if that person has changed their name legally. So
Mhm.
you will be privy to very private information uh, by receiving that background check, or the results of that background check. And also, there are a lot of challenges with police for
Mhm.
trans and non binary folks, whether they've asked for help from the police and then there's not a lot of training among police
Mhm.
officers on how to interact respectfully with trans folks and rely heavily on IDs. And so there might be a past difficulty slash trauma, especially I would say trans people of color. There's that added layer of like now having to go to police where perhaps there's this past that really presents a challenge for them to go
Mhm.
to police, and fingerprinting too. And so there's just these layers that need to be understood, one, and then considered as well, to say, just to let you know. And I like to kind of outline that. Most job
Mhm.
descriptions tend to add that in there, but maybe even some reference in the job description that the employer is willing to work with an individual on a
Mhm.
background check. You don't have to say because of trans or non-binary folks, but just generally that there's that openness to talk about it and to figure out a way that can really bring down a lot of the anxieties that folks have about this particular step. So again,
Mhm.
just offering to say, hey, there's a background check as part of this. I can appreciate that that might bring up a past name that you
Mhm.
may have, and just to let you know, we have privacy features in place where only one person in the hiring committee gets that result,
Mhm.
right? So we're not sharing that with everybody else to be like, oh, did you know Tanya used to be Tom? That kind of
Mm. Right.
salacious detail, kind of a bit on the gossipy side of things, which that clouds things within the hiring process rather than
Mhm.
just one person gets it and they deal with it in a matter of fact way, and that's it. And that can actually create a lot more trust with the trans person or non-binary
Mhm.
person being hired, to know that, okay, these people understand the gravity of this
Mhm.
process and they have certain mechanisms in place and they've approached me with sensitivity, and I don't like it, but here we go and we're going to do it, right? So
Mhm.
yeah.
We've been talking a lot about the struggles and the sort of negative aspects of hiring
Mm,
for trans and non-binary people, but there are some really great stuff too. And I was
mhm,
wondering if you could go into that, like the real positives about experiences, or even just why trans
mm.
and non-binary people are people worth considering when it comes to hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important to understand that, yes, there's a few extra steps or considerations, but actually, we know from stats collected among 27,000 trans folks that the majority of them are highly educated. And of course, don't just need to be highly educated to be employed, obviously, but there are folks who disproportionate to the population, two more times educated compared to the general population. So
Mhm.
I don't know why that is. We'd have to dig a little further to see. Perhaps we have a bunch of overachievers. I don't know, but um, yeah. So I think sometimes people are surprised by that stat. It's this mixture of um, really educated and vastly unemployed.
Mhm.
So because of
Yeah.
discrimination, there's like a 15% unemployment rate among trans and non-binary folks. So three
Really.
times that of the general population. Yeah, it's high, and maybe increasing. Like we don't have recent
Mhm.
stats, so especially with what's going on now, and so there's this like highly educated, untapped talent that
Mhm.
if organizations are able to adjust a few things here and there or just be considerate, they
Mhm.
actually can access. And what we find is that if one trans person has a really good experience, they tend to spread that to be like, oh my gosh, at this organization, like it doesn't even have to be that big. People like,
Mhm.
they just thought about this thing. And then I was like, holy, I've never had that experience. And
Mhm.
that spreads like wildfire and then can then tend to have other people apply too, right?
Mhm.
Or that you have gender affirming health extended healthcare benefits. That's hugely motivating to many. So there are these kind of positive aspects beyond that. You know, like many people, hardworking, creative. Of course, it's not everybody. Like we come in all different shapes and sizes and abilities, but I do find that because trans and non-binary folks tend to be discriminated against and probably cast out a lot.
Mhm.
There is a tremendous amount of resilience where no matter the issue or the problem that's being solved in their role, there is a persistence to figure things out, and not to take the status quo. It's like thinking outside the box and coming up with different ways of doing things that perhaps weren't thought of. And so there's a lot of potential, especially for innovation.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think there's a tremendous amount of benefits. There's a lot of gifts that trans and non-binary folks have to share with everyone else.
Mhm. I read a stat, and I can't remember any of the details of it, so hopefully you do.
Okay.
But I read a stat about how, especially millennial and Gen Z
Mm,
employees, regardless of whether they are trans themselves, and we have mentioned this earlier, but the more inclusive an environment is, like
mm,
it's one of the top things that they're looking for in future employers. So
yeah.
if you are sort of leveling up when it comes to trans and non-binary people, you're more likely not only to get some very, very highly qualified people to
Mm,
want to join your team, but also that extends further out into cisgender people too,
mm.
especially when it comes to sort of younger up and coming talent.
Very much so. I'm trying to remember the specific stat. I think there were different questions. There was, the are you wanting an inclusive workplace? Or no, there was do you know somebody with gender neutral pronouns? That was
Mm.
40%, around 40%. Knew somebody with gender neutral pronouns.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, and it differs between millennial and Gen Z. I think it's a bit
Hmm.
higher for Gen Z.
Hmm.
And then there was, do you expect or want gender neutral washrooms within the workplace? And that was like 73%. They're like, this is a no
Really?
brainer. Yeah, you got
Yeah,
to have it. Like, let's get on
that's
it.
super exciting. Yeah.
So, um, and then I think there were a few other questions that I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Hmm.
essentially, no matter the question, it's overwhelming connection, understanding, and you know, expectation for
Hmm.
inclusion. Right? And this is for mostly cisgender folks that are being surveyed there. So
Hmm.
it's worth noting because it's maybe a bit quiet now, where it's maybe requests, and then if they're ignored, then either people leave or their requests become stronger. You know, shift into demands and unnecessary. Uh, tussle on
Yeah,
these issues.
drama.
Yeah, when you could just, oh, thank you for sharing and let's figure something out, rather than like waiting for a bunch of harm and
Hmm.
frustration to materialize. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, I have run out of questions in my head. Are we good?
That's it.
Is there anything I've missed that you really want to talk about?
There's one thing. Generally at Transfocus, we don't talk a lot about recruiting, and it's actually very
Oh,
intentional. And it's not because we don't want, obviously, that's the whole kind of where we're angling. We want
sure.
trans and non-binary folks to be hired, obviously. However, because there's so many different areas where trans and non-binary folks bump up against challenges or structural limitations or cultural interaction-based issues, we tend to encourage organizations to fix first and then like look
Mm,
inward and then look outward.
right.
And there's some degree that you can do both at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, but I tend to encourage at the very least to understand what the issues are, so that you're not kind of surprised when a trans
Mm,
person comes in and has a bunch of problems. And then that also ensures that you're not making the trans person the problem. That can sometimes
right.
happen, where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it seems like a you thing rather than a us thing.
Hmm.
And so
For
we just
sure.
just look around, take a bit of an audit to really ensure that at least your house is beginning to be prepared, and then look outward to include folks. I also encourage, especially if one's house has been prepared. Speaking of cozy, making it inviting and welcoming. Uh, it's also about going to specific places. I find a lot of organizations are like, well, we posted this thing, and I'm like, well, yes, some people might see it, but are you reaching out to specific organizations with that information, right?
Hmm.
Either LGBT job posting sites, or
Mm,
there are job fairs that go on. There was one in Toronto a few years for trans and non-binary folks specifically, and
mm,
a bunch of organizations came. It was really lovely, and it's a good way to connect with the community, to know what's happening, to talk to people, to get to know folks. And there's just so much more benefit than just hiring folks from interacting in that way. So definitely looking out for those opportunities, I think, is really key. So those are just a few other tips to be not just waiting for folks, but to be actively reaching out within their circles.
mm. We have a resource that I will
Mm.
link in the show notes.
Yeah. So, Thriving at Work resource is specifically for trans and non binary folks, because we totally appreciate it's so daunting to get a job as a trans person. There's so much at play, and it's just like, how do you even approach this in a way that feels empowering, impactful? How can you know what to ask for, and what you can just let slide? So we've got a bunch of information that helps folks who are seeking a job in terms of where to go to find those inclusive employers, what to look for if you maybe don't know, if you didn't go to an LGBT job post, but you found a really interesting job. And what are some of the things that you can look out for to see what kinds of work the organization has done, and a bunch of other kind of supports as well, recognizing that there's a lot of labor to this, and being in a community of people who are maybe going through similar things can really help with that. So we've put that all together to help out trans and non-binary folks, recognizing that challenge that they face.
You also have a resource for employers, and I was wondering if you could explain that a bit.
Yeah, we've set up a resource or created a resource that just, has a bit of more detail around, reference checks and background checks and how
Hmm.
to set up job posts well. And so it just gives you a bit of the tips and the tools of how to do that. And I'm trying to remember how long it is, but it's got quite a bit of detail and just
Yeah.
allows for that forethought. And again, it's not that much extra effort, but at the very least to have these things on the radar, especially for human resources folks and hiring managers or whatnot. So I think that'll be hopefully a very useful resource for them.
Amazing. Cool. Is there anything else? Have I missed anything?
No, this
Okay,
was
sweet.
great. Yeah, it was good to go through recruiting. It's yeah, there's many pieces to the puzzle, but hopefully enough for practical steps forward to help folks to be hired because yeah, we're good employees.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kai.
Yeah,
See you next week.
yeah, thank you, bye for now.